Today we're going over 15 plus History Mandela Effects. Topics include Al Capone, the Statue of Liberty, Nikola Tesla, World War II, my favorite Mandela Effect of all time, and so much more. Who designed the first American flag? I'll give you a few seconds to think about it. Was it Betsy Ross? Growing up, you probably learned that Elizabeth Betsy Ross designed and made the first American flag back in 1776, which was adopted by Congress the very next year. The classic red and white striped flag with 13 stars. But here I am to tell you that no, there is in fact no evidence that she had anything to do with the first American flag. Nothing. She didn't design it, she didn't make it, she didn't stitch it, nothing. Mark Leepson, an American journalist and historian, stated in an interview, as far as the big question is concerned, did she make the first American flag? Every historical study has come to show the same conclusion. There's no good historical evidence that she did. Most historians believe the story is apocryphal, as in doubtful and lacking authenticity. It's widely circulated as being true, but simply isn't. Credit for the first flag goes to Francis Hopkinson, and just wait until you hear about him. This man is going to make you feel beyond insignificant, so prepare yourself. Francis Hopkinson was an American founding father, a college graduate, a lawyer, a jurist, an author and poet, a composer, a delegate of New Jersey. He designed continental paper money, as well as early flags for the Navy and the United States. Talk about accomplished. So what do you think? Is this the history you remember, or has something changed? If you found this interesting, get ready. I've got so many more historical Mandela effects to go. Let's get into them. Al Capone, also known by the nickname Scarface, is one of America's most famous gangsters back during the Prohibition era. This rich and powerful businessman, as he called himself, was also the boss of the Chicago Outfit, aka the Chicago Mob. Al Capone reigned supreme for 7 long years before the US government finally took him down. It wasn't for his crimes of extortion, murder, robbery, or bootlegging that took him down. It was tax evasion. In 1931, Al Capone was convicted and sentenced to 11 years in prison, but he was only imprisoned for 8 years. Here is where the Mandela Effect comes in. What happened to Al Capone? It's a widely known fact today that when he entered prison, he had syphilis, which remained untreated for the vast majority of his stay. By the end of his life, he was actually diagnosed as having the mental age of a 12-year-old. So tell me, where did Al Capone die? Was it in Alcatraz prison, or was it in his home in Florida? I am one of the many people who were taught that Al Capone had died in prison. Well, it turns out, after 8 years of incarceration, he was paroled in 1939, and he actually lived on for 8 more years after his prison sentence. What did you remember? And get this, Al Capone spent his last years of his life at his mansion in Palm Island, Florida, spending time with his wife and grandchildren. Then, because of complications of syphilis, he eventually suffered, yet survived a stroke, but then not long after, he died of cardiac arrest. This timeline is drastically different than the one that I remember learning about and studying growing up. So what about you? Do you remember Al Capone dying in prison, or dying 8 years later surrounded by his family and loved ones? Here is a World War II Mandela Effect. What many of us remember is that the only attack on American soil by the Japanese during World War II was Pearl Harbor. As of now, that isn't the only attack. They also dropped at least 1,000 bombs all over the western half of the United States. The Japanese launched, from 1944 to 1945, over 9,300 fire balloons into the sky to be carried by the Pacific winds over to the United States of America. These were called Fugo balloons and were also known as fire balloons. Online, there are thousands of accounts of people not remembering this at all, even from people living within the states affected by the bombs. Does this sound familiar to you? These hydrogen balloons carried anti-personnel bombs, incendiary bombs, and incendiary devices. The goal was to create a cheap way of attacking American cities, forests, and farmlands, and cause the US military to focus on the home front instead of the Pacific front that at that time they were waging against Japan. Jet streams carried these bombs all over the western part of America, and even in Mexico and Canada, there were reports of seeing these bombs. Weird that so many of us don't ever remember learning about this event. After 30 to 60 hours, the balloon bombs would reach the western coast. Around 1,000 landed, and out of all of the balloons that landed or exploded, only one achieved its awful goal. On May 5th, 1945, 6 lives were lost after finding and playing with a large balloon found in the woods near Bly, Oregon. These 6 deaths were the only enemy-inflicted casualties on the US mainland during World War II. Have any of you heard of this before? Read about it in a history book? Seen a documentary on it? Let me know in the comments below. I can't be the only one. The massive ancient pyramids of Egypt, some of the greatest wonders left in the world, known worldwide for their vast size, striking design, intricate construction, immense complexity, and overall wonder. The pyramids of Giza have inspired countless minds. When one thinks of the Great Pyramids, what else comes to mind? Ancient gods, pharaohs, hieroglyphics, and especially mummies. As mainstream Egyptologists and archaeologists understand the pyramids now, they claim that the pyramids were massive tombs to house great pharaohs after death. But what if I were to tell you that within the Great Pyramids of the Giza Pyramid Complex, no mummies or mummified pharaohs have ever been found? That's right, not a single ancient body has ever been discovered inside the pyramids. In fact, all of the mummies, sarcophagi, and pharaohs ever discovered have been found in locations near the pyramids, but never inside them. Places such as the Valley of the Kings, hidden royal tombs, and cemeteries located all around the pyramids. The belief that pyramids were tombs are largely based on speculation with no hard evidence or bodies to support that claim. For example, one of the most well-known pharaohs was the young Tutankhamun, also known as King Tut. Where was his sarcophagus discovered? In the Valley of the Kings. So what about Tutankhamun's father, Akhenaten? Where was he buried? Well, which archaeological site he's buried in is still debated to this day, but it's either the royal tomb of Akhenaten in Amarna or the Valley of the Kings. Well, what about Ramses II, also known as Ramses the Great, or Osmandius in Greek? Where was he buried? The East, Valley of the Kings. What about Amenhotep III, also known as Amenhotep the Magnificent? Well, you guessed it, the Valley of the Kings, this time in the Western Valley. So many famous pharaohs, and not a single one of them were ever laid to rest in the Great Pyramids of Giza. I find that not just fascinating, but absolutely astonishing. Not a single body, not a single mummy, not a single pharaoh, nothing. Up next is one of the earliest examples of a Mandela effect, but also one of the most compelling. What Mandela effect am I talking about? The 35th President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, or better known today as JFK. On November 22, 1963, tragedy struck when JFK was assassinated while riding in his motorcade in Dallas, Texas. Now, this awful day isn't in dispute. This actually happened, obviously. But what is in dispute are the details surrounding it. Some claim that the footage was originally in black and white, but now it's in color. Others claim it originally didn't have sound, but now it does. But the biggest Mandela effect surrounding that day is the car JFK was riding in. It was an open-top 1961 Lincoln Continental 4-door convertible. What a mouthful. Now here's my question. On that fateful day, how many people were sitting in the car? Was it 4 people, or was it 6 people? The correct answer is now 6 people. The famous Zapruder film now shows a total of 6 people riding in the Lincoln Continental, instead of the 4 that so many people seem to remember. So where do you stand on this? Here is some interesting leftover residue arguing the case for 4 people. There are multiple museums across America with replica cars from that day, and they only have 4 seats. I've been to one of these museum displays myself, and it's a really weird detail to miss out on, that you rebuilt an exact replica of that car, but you have 4 seats instead of 6. I'm supposed to assume that everyone overlooked that small detail of an extra row of seats? Huh. Numerous books out there detailing the mystery surrounding JFK's death also make the mistake of saying the car only had 4 passengers. Even classic movies regarding the death of JFK make the same mistake. So is it all a mistake? Was no one paying attention at any point of production over the past 60 years? I think the biggest and most damning detail surrounding this historical Mandela effect is that the Secret Service got it wrong. In the investigative reenactment film made of the assassination by the Secret Service, they utilized a 4-person version of the car. How on earth could such a monumentally important aspect of the recreation be recreated incorrectly? Well, I'll let you decide. To this day, this one still has people confused. The date is August 2nd, 1980. Today is the date of the Bologna massacre. On this dreadful morning, a time bomb placed inside of an unattended suitcase was left in the waiting room at the Bologna Centrale railway station. When it went off, over 200 people were injured and over 85 people died. The blast collapsed the roof of the waiting room, destroyed most of the main buildings, and even hit a train waiting nearby for boarding. The station that day was filled with tourists and Italians seeking refuge from the blazing summer heat. This attack is known as the worst atrocity in Italy since World War II. Now, I bring up this awful tragedy because there is a fascinating Mandela Effect attached to it. Fascinating enough, it could be its own Mandela Effect mystery, like the video series that I have. But for now, we're just going to discuss it in this video. There is a giant clock on the wall of the Bologna station that stopped working at the exact moment of the attack. On the clock, it reads 10:25 a.m. Now here is where things get weird. Was the clock left at 10:25 a.m. in remembrance of this tragedy, or was it repaired right away? Thousands of people have gone on record as remembering the clock being left at 10:25 a.m. permanently. Newspapers talked about this and even photographs were taken, but now it turns out that it was repaired right away. And for 15 years the clock worked perfectly. In 1995, when it finally broke again, the clock was permanently set to 10:25 a.m. in remembrance of what had happened prior. So here's where things get weirder. An unbelievable number of people remember this clock being stopped all of those 15 years. So many, in fact, that scientific investigations were done to get to the bottom of this massive case of misremembering. This is one of the earliest modern examples of the Mandela Effect. So early, in fact, that the term Mandela Effect had not yet even been coined. The study showed that 92% of participants believed the clock had been broken the whole time. Not as in fixed right away, left on for 15 years, then stopped, but actually broken since 1980. 92%. Now, another 79% of participants claim to have personally seen the clock set to 10:25 a.m. And get this, that's 79%? That includes all 21 railway employees. An utterly staggering statistic. So if you know this case, what do you remember? Is this all a massive case of misremembering? Did everyone simply not pay attention for 15 years? Or has the Mandela Effect struck again? What started as a bright and sunny morning turned to tragedy in an instant and continued to get worse as the day went on. But strangely enough, we aren't talking about the obvious details regarding that horrible day. We're actually talking about a concurrent event that will hopefully confuse and bewilder some of you. Did you know on September 11th, 2001, New York City was supposed to get hit by a massive hurricane named Hurricane Erin? Here is one of the reported images of this hurricane from back then, and as you can see, it's massive. Does any of this sound familiar? Do any of you remember hearing about a hurricane about to hit New York City on the same day that the towers went down? It had been heading on an impossibly straight line for New York City for 4 to 5 days. The closest it got to landfall was the coast of New York. Supposedly, Hurricane Erin's size was comparable to Hurricane Katrina, and its power was comparable to Hurricane Sandy.
Country kids on this Tuesday, the night of the Latin Grammys. Sunny skies down through Texas, all the way from the bottom of Texas to the top of North Dakota. Little rain to the right of North Dakota. Parts of North Dakota may see a little rain. To the west of the country, no problem. To the east in the country, no problems except down in Florida, a little rain. Other than that, it's kind of quiet around the country. We like quiet. It's quiet. It's too quiet. That's a quick look at the national forecast. Here's an early look at your weather.
Hurricane Erin got so close to hitting that thunder and rain were reported at JFK Airport, Newark Airport, as well as LaGuardia Airport. So why don't any of us remember this massive hurricane hitting New York City? Why did all of the 9/11 photos and videos show bright and sunny skies? Well, apparently right before landfall on the morning of September 11th, 2001, Hurricane Erin did a near unprecedented turn of 150 degrees and just flew off into the ocean. It's as if Hurricane Erin realized that enough tragedy was going to happen that day, it just decided to leave. Do you ever remember hearing about Hurricane Erin, or have you ever heard anyone discuss it ever since? I came across this while doing some research for my last video, and I can't help but be amazed. A hurricane with such insane power and size was about to strike on the same day as America's biggest tragedy, but instead turns around and disappears, only to never be talked about or mentioned again. This one, I don't even know what to say. As always, let me hear all of your thoughts about this one, as well as all the other Mandela Effects I talked about today, in the comments below. This historical Mandela Effect is regarding attacks done to America during this war. We all know about the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. And in a previous video, I talked about the explosive balloon bombs that Japan attempted to float across the sea to lay siege to the western United States. Well, today we're talking about attacks on the eastern coast of the United States during World War II. Specifically German attacks that resulted in the death of over 5,000 Americans. Here's my question for you. Did 5,000 Americans die on the East Coast during World War II? Yes or no? The answer now is an unfortunate yes. 5,000 Americans. Do you remember learning about what I'm talking about, or is your brain blanking on this one? Well, you aren't alone. Apparently, they blew up over 400 American ships, which resulted in the death of over 5,000 Americans. We're talking Nazi submarines off the coast, as far down as even North Carolina. What? Apparently, these submarines were hunting Allied ships and attempted to, and in some cases succeeded in, destroying them before supplies and armaments could reach the Allied forces fighting in Europe. Here's a tease of some of the previously unknown but now apparently always known stuff that went down on the East Coast in the United States during World War II. An oil tanker explosion off the coast of North Carolina by Nazi torpedoes. Submarine blockades in the Delaware Bay. Giant coastal watchtowers in New Jersey searching for subs. Soldiers on horseback and Coast Guard officers patrolling beaches looking for landing spies. And even a massive blimp squadron patrolling American skies looking for enemy submarines. Do you remember learning about any of this before this video? A documentary maybe? A history book? A teacher? If you're like many online, you've never heard of any of this. So you might be thinking, maybe this is all classified or top secret. Nope. It was published in newspapers and news media back in the day. So it wasn't like this information was a secret. So why do so few people know any of this? Is it a simple lack of education? And if that's the case, then why do some self-proclaimed history buffs also seem confused? Did everyone just forget these events? Did all of these things happen and people are only recently rediscovering the modern past? Or is this another case of the Mandela Effect, where small changes over time produce big differences from what we remember learning? Here's another interesting one. If you've watched my channel over the past few years, you know I love a good update. So next, let's talk about something I originally covered back in Brand New Mandela Effects Part 5, the Hindenburg explosion. So before we get into what's new, here's a clip of what I said then. The date is May 6th, 1937, Lakehurst, New Jersey. The German airship, the Hindenburg, is the largest object ever to soar through the air. While attempting to land, the massive Zeppelin caught fire and exploded. Within 30 seconds, the German airship was no more. This horrible tragedy was famously captured on film, and because of this film disaster, the age of the commercial airship travel had come to an end. Now, here is the Mandela Effect. Of the 97 passengers and crew, everyone on board died that day. Within 30 seconds, the Zeppelin burnt up and crashed. There was no way anyone could have survived that fiery crash. That isn't the case now. Despite the footage agreeing with what I remember, amazingly enough, 62 of the 94 passengers and crew survived. Somehow. This horrifying disaster took the lives of 35 people, 13 passengers, 22 crewmen, and 1 member of the ground crew who was trying to help the Hindenburg land. What do you remember about this? Did everyone on board perish, or did 2/3 of the people on board mysteriously survive this blazing inferno after a massive drop? If so, how? Even on History.com, under an article titled, The Hindenburg Disaster, 9 Surprising Facts, the first surprising fact to them is that the, quote, survivors of the Hindenburg disaster far outnumbered the victims. Why would that be surprising if that's exactly what happened? We would have known that news back in that day in 1937, and most a couple days afterwards. My takeaway is that even the author assigned to do that article was shocked by this historical change. Another interesting detail is that despite the Hindenburg explosion in 1937 being known by many, myself included, as history's deadliest airship accident, it is actually the 3rd deadliest now. It turns out accidents from 1930 and 1933 actually surpass the Hindenburg's current death toll. It seems that history loves to rewrite itself from time to time, and this is yet another example I've talked about on this channel. Now that you're up to date, what's new? Well, it's been recently rediscovered that there was actually another video of the disaster. A better video that shows more. I wish I was joking. Apparently people knew of it back then, but didn't use it or talk about it or anything. It just existed, people weren't interested, and that was that. Your guess is as good as mine. This footage starts off pre-disaster, and because of the camera being used, it could only record for short periods of time. Now remember this as you're watching. Of the 97 people on board, 67 somehow survived this. I'm still blown away by that. Anyway, what do you think of this newly discovered 86-year-old footage? I think it's just incredible. Imagine having this, and sitting on it, for that long. It's as if this footage just spawned into existence and everyone said, yeah, okay. This actually makes me excited for the future. I can't wait to see what newly discovered footage will pop up next. New Hiroshima footage? New 9/11 footage? How about JFK? Can we get a new video of that? Footage of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand? Or my personal favorite idea, newly discovered footage taken by a farmer of the Roswell crash. Maybe he was there on his field, he was filming crops for some reason, and he caught the whole crash on video. And everybody knew about the footage, we just all forgot about it, because why not? Why not? I just love this world we live in. Every day it's something, and we're so battered and beaten down that we don't even blink anymore. Something changes, something insane happens, it's just another day. I guess we just never noticed that before. So give me your best theory on what footage will miraculously appear next. Well, what about the former science fiction turned science fact concept of video phones? You know, it's a phone call, but you can see the other person on the other side of the phone. Now we have FaceTime, Skype, and other similar apps, but for the longest time, this was the future. I used to think, oh man, when this is real, we'll know we've made it, because we're living in the future. But now that we have it, no one really wants to do it, because who wants to get showered and cleaned up for a phone call? Just text me. In the 1960s, Bell System, later renamed AT&T, showed off their picture phone as a prototype at the New York City World's Fair.
Good morning, John. You're looking well this morning. I'm very pleased and proud, John, to participate with you this morning in this historic call and city of...
But that wasn't the first showing of this technology. Even though at the time, this was shown off as a brand new thing never before seen or realized. What if I told you that video phones existed, and not just in concept, but actually existed and were publicly used 87 years ago? Go ahead, take a moment to take that in. 87 years ago. Germany, 1936. The world's first two-way video phone service launched. This unbelievable historical achievement that seemingly spawned into existence was so far ahead of its time. Get this, it connected to a range of 100 miles to multiple cities in Germany and was open to the public. It ran at 25 frames per second on a CRT display at a resolution of 172 rows, which equated to about 40,000 pixels. It was said to be so detailed that you could read the hands on a wristwatch. 3-minute phone calls were priced at about 1/15 of the average German's weekly wage. Each city had a few booths, and all you had to do was make an appointment ahead of time at the post office. Then World War II came around, and their plans to extend the network were abandoned for obvious reasons. By 1940, the entire system was shut down. Today we are looking at the life and death of Harry Houdini. Harry Houdini is world famous for his illusions and stunt performances. He became popular because of his ridiculously impressive escape stunts. Small stuff like being handcuffed and escaping, to massively dangerous and more impressive stunts like getting free of a straitjacket while hanging upside down from a skyscraper as civilians watched below. Harry Houdini has made elephants disappear, escaped from a box thrown overboard, and even escaped from being buried alive. Harry Houdini had an impressive array of illusions and even a few movies, but what most people remember about him is his death. So, here is my question to you. How did Harry Houdini die? Was it drowning? Suffocation? A ruptured appendix? Or was it lung cancer? Many people, including myself, believe that Harry Houdini died performing one of his stunts. As it is now, that isn't the case. He actually died of a ruptured appendix. What I had always believed was that Harry Houdini died during his Chinese water torture act. That he wasn't able to escape in time and drowned in front of a horrified audience. Thankfully, this isn't what happened anymore, but his death is still very bizarre. He was indeed injured during that performance, but only on his leg because of faulty equipment. He limped through the rest of the show, but he survived. I absolutely love this stuff because it feels like alternate history. It's as if things get to play out differently. Some things for the better, but some things for the much worse. Anyway, back to Houdini. 11 days later, Harry Houdini was giving a lecture at McGill University in Montreal. After this lecture, he spoke with students in his dressing room. One student asked if he really could resist hard punches to his abdomen, a claim that he had previously made. Harry agreed, and before he could react, he was hit with 4 or 5 forcible, deliberate, and well-directed blows to his stomach. He played it off well in front of the students, but those punches did indeed rupture his appendix, and he died on October 31st. When did the carrying of the Olympic flame begin? I'll give you a second to think about this. What year was it? From what I always understood, this has existed as long as the Olympics have. That the ancient Greeks considered fire to be a divine element, a symbol connecting mankind and the gods. Back then, a flame burned permanently at the altar of Zeus and Hera, the same place where the Olympic flame is ultimately brought to today. But no, the Olympic flame relay began in 1936 in Berlin, Germany. Yeah. As it is now, the Olympic torch relay was nothing more than Nazi propaganda. So tell me in the comments below, does that sound right to you? Was the first Olympic torch relay started in 1936? In this house lived the famous Charles Lindbergh and his wife Anne Morrow Lindbergh and their 20-month-old son, Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. The father was world famous at the time for making the first solo, non-stop transatlantic flight from New York to France. This 3,600-mile voyage took 33.5 hours to complete and brought him fame and notoriety. Unfortunately, his name will forever be tied to a much darker event. The date is March 1st, 1932. The location is East Amwell, New Jersey, the Lindbergh House. What happened here was called the crime of the century because of the mystery and the nature of the crime. Between 8 p.m. and 10 p.m., Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. was kidnapped from his upstairs nursery. A crudely drawn ransom note was left behind. This kidnapping was such a big event at the time that the President of the United States, Herbert Hoover, was notified the following morning about it. This is where the Mandela Effect comes in. What do you remember about this case? Is the Lindbergh baby still missing to this day? Or was the child found? Well, if you're like me, you remember the Lindbergh baby was never found. It's a mystery that resulted in years of speculation, wild accusation, rumors of it being an inside job, and so many more theories. The mystery of what actually happened to little Charles Lindbergh continued to this day, or at least it did. It turns out that now the Lindbergh baby was found 2 months after his disappearance, and unfortunately he was found deceased. Not only that, his kidnapper and murderer was captured, prosecuted, and eventually put to death within 4 years of the crime being committed. Upon doing more research into this, I'm not alone in my belief that the baby was never found and that no one was convicted for his kidnapping and murder. I've read numerous comments and threads of other bewildered people who are just as confused by this change as I am. So what do you think? Do you remember hearing that the Lindbergh baby was found? Or do you remember hearing that he is still missing to this day? I can't wait to hear your thoughts about this in the comments below. Jackie Robinson was not only a great baseball player, but actually the first black athlete to ever play Major League Baseball, all the way back in 1947. He was even inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame in 1962. This next Mandela Effect has to do with him. And don't worry, you don't need to understand any sports knowledge for this to land, because this one has to do with a hug. More on that in a second. The date is May 13th, 1947. The game is between the Brooklyn Dodgers and the Cincinnati Reds. Jackie Robinson had only been in the major leagues for a month at this point. Because he was the first black athlete to play in the MLB, and the fact that it was 1947, racial tension was sadly still at an all-time high. In fact, some of his own teammates had asked management to trade them away rather than play baseball with him. Not only that, his opponents threatened to boycott. He received death threats, and pitches were even thrown directly at his head. But during that 1947 game, as the crowd taunted him, a teammate named Pee Wee Reese, a white man from Kentucky, crossed the field and walked up to Jackie and put his arm around him, and the crowd got quiet. This beautiful example of solidarity has been talked about ever since. This historical moment in sports history has been talked about and discussed in news stories, documentaries, feature films, biographies, articles, and even, get this, got a statue in Brooklyn in 2005. So here comes the Mandela Effect. This never happened. There was never a hug. Pee Wee Reese never walked up to Jackie Robinson, never gave him a hug during that game, and this story, apparently, never happened. Despite all the press, articles, stories, movies, biographies, and books, it just didn't happen. This went from one of the most legendary moments in baseball history to one of the most legendary mysteries. As history goes now, Jackie Robinson earned the respect of many of his teammates that year and helped lead his team, the Dodgers, to the World Series, but that on-field hug never happened. It was something that everyone believed happened, but didn't, like a shared memory of an event that never took place. So what are your thoughts on all this? Had you ever heard of the hug before? Did you know that it didn't happen? Or is this all news to you as well? Let me hear it in the comments below. The Serbian-American inventor, engineer, and futurist Nikola Tesla was one of the most influential minds of his time. The man behind alternating currents, radio control, wireless charging, a literal death ray, and even the ability to give wireless power to the entire world. These are just a few of the incredible inventions created by the genius Nikola Tesla. But despite all of these incredible accomplishments, I'm not bringing up Nikola Tesla in regards to his discoveries, but instead because he's tied to a fascinating Mandela effect. This effect is a two-part conundrum. The first part being, how did Nikola Tesla die? And the second part being, what age was he when he died? So again, how did Nikola Tesla die? Was it a car accident or a heart attack? And the second question is, what age was Nikola Tesla when he died? Middle age or old age? The answers are now a heart attack and old age. Does that sound right to you? Plenty of people seem to remember an almost alternate version of history where Tesla died because he was hit by a car. Here's what, as of right now, actually happened. Nikola Tesla was struck by a taxicab while walking back to his hotel in 1937 at the age of 81. He somehow survived this, but refused to go to the hospital or even consult a doctor because of an immense fear of doctors and hospitals from an early age. As it goes now, Tesla lived on for 5 more years until his death at the age of 86 in 1943. His cause of death was ruled a coronary thrombosis, which is a blood clot in the heart, so to keep it simple, a heart attack. Although it is still true that the FBI collected all of his belongings 2 days after his death, this Mandela effect has tripped up a lot of people online. So now I'm curious to hear what all of you remember about the life and the death of the legendary Nikola Tesla. Tell me all your thoughts about him in the comments below. Up next, we're talking about something that happened in June 1989, during the Tiananmen Square protests in China. A lone man, still unknown to this day, taking a bold stance and standing weaponless in front of a row of military tanks. The famous footage of this man is one of my personal earliest memories of being interested in history. Why was this man standing up to a tank, let alone a row of tanks? He must have known how little of a chance he stood, right? Was his belief that strong? Apparently it was. So here's my Mandela effect for you. What happened to that brave man in the moments afterwards? Did the tanks stop? Or did they crush him? Well, if you remember things like so many others do, you remember the tank unfortunately driving over the man. This was a haunting and gut-wrenching scene. The alleged memory goes that the act happened so quickly and so violently that it took even the cameraman a period of time to turn away and stop filming. But as it is now, the tank apparently stopped. His terrifyingly brave act stopped those tanks, if even just for a few moments. Now, this isn't just a personal Mandela effect or a small-scale one. This was written about in books and old articles. People remember that brave guy being driven over, but as the footage shows now, he never was. In mainland China, this incident was called the June 4th incident, but outside of China as the June 4th massacre. But the true count to us will never be known. I love learning about history, not just for the fascinating stories and the shocking events, but for the historical insight gained from learning about history. The more you study it, the more you see patterns and trends popping up throughout history. Strangely enough, when it comes to the Mandela effect, these kinds of patterns and trends tend to happen as well. Where there is smoke, there's usually fire. Once you find one Mandela effect on a topic or a subject, the more you dig, you're bound to find more. Well, that is exactly what happened this time. Years ago, I covered the fascinatingly unbelievable concept of Dazzle ships, used in World War I and World War II. While most people think of Navy battleships as gray, these ships were actually covered in multicolored shapes and designs. For context, I'm going to play an older clip I made about Dazzle ships from this video, link in the description. Then we're going to come back and build off of that video. So if this clip sounds familiar, that's why. Let's check it out. Think back to when you learned about World War I and World War II. Visualize the massive warships that were utilized back then. Now, what color were those ships? Were they covered in abstract designs, or was it solid colors like gray? What do you remember learning? In World War I, and to a lesser extent in World War II, to avoid ship destruction at the hands of German U-boats, ships were painted in Dazzle camouflage. This is actually how history goes now, believe it or not. The hulls of Dazzle ships were covered in stripes, swirls, colors, and abstract shapes, reminiscent of Pablo Picasso's work. The idea was that the overwhelming mix of colors and shapes would confuse enemy U-boats looking through a periscope. thus making it more difficult to gauge the size, speed, and direction of these Dazzle ships. Despite other people's memories, including my own to the contrary, this was a common practice. It started in Britain, but eventually spread to the US. It turns out that Dazzle ships were surprisingly effective. So much so that during World War II, Dazzle camouflage was utilized again by the US and even used on the decks of ships to confuse enemy aircrafts. Does any of this sound right to you? Growing up on the East Coast and being a big history buff, I've even visited some of these ships. But amazingly, I've never seen one in full Dazzle paint, let alone any mention of this throughout history. So all of my education, all of my personal studies, all the documentaries and movies and things that I've watched, nothing. What do you all think? Is this exactly as you learned it? Or is this something completely confusing to you? Recently, I fell down a World War II well of information, and before you know it, I was on the subject of D-Day. The June 6, 1944 Allied forces invasion of Normandy, France to repel back the Nazi forces. Cited as the largest seaborne invasion in history, I'm sure the vast majority of you have heard about this before in history books or articles, documentaries, and movies like Saving Private Ryan. Everyone with an interest in D-Day history has seen this shot before. The soldiers huddled together on an LCVD landing craft, mere minutes before the bullets start flying and the craft door opens. But what's that to the left? Is that the tip of a Dazzle ship? Yes. Yes, it is. So get this. Not only are some of the major ships used during D-Day Dazzle ships, even a bunch of the Normandy landing crafts and tank carriers are now Dazzle ships as well. They are beautifully colored with isometric designs, shapes, and colors. Sure, why not? Everything else seems to change, so why would I think these wouldn't? And here's the interesting thing. If you look it up, you'll find the weird thing is that there are still tons of residue of certain ships and landing crafts that aren't Dazzle designs. Some are still gray. But every time I check back on this strange Mandela effect, there seems to be more and more and more. It's almost like it's a Mandela effect in progress, like a slow transition from gray to all of them being Dazzle ships. So 5 years from now, if they are all gray, remember, they weren't always. In fact, since I made this original video on October 30th, 2019, the amount of digital content available for Dazzle ships has exploded. For example, the clip that I showed you from an earlier video, when I made that, I used nearly every single photo and painting I could find on Dazzle ships. It was that rare. That kind of information was really hard to find. But now there are so many more photos and articles about this stuff. Let's try to be logical here. Could just be that some of the landing crafts were gray, and some were extremely colorful and vibrant for some reason or another, and everyone just didn't notice and we didn't talk about it. I mean, it's possible, right? You could also say, well, some ships belong to some countries and some belong to others. Absolutely. No one is disputing that. What is being disputed is their existence entirely. But if that wasn't strange enough, that's not even the biggest Mandela effect regarding this day. People online started noticing something was off with photos of D-Day. Take a look at this photo and tell me if you see anything weird. What caused this off feeling for so many people? Perhaps you noticed it yourself. It's the dozens and dozens of balloons floating in the sky. Do you remember seeing these in photographs or documentaries, reading about them, learning about them, ever seeing an article on them? Well, if not, these are called barrage balloons. And on D-Day, the sky was covered in hundreds of them. These anchored balloons created a cluttered mess above the sky to prevent enemy plane attacks, because oftentimes there were bombs attached to these balloons. Historically speaking, this makes perfect sense. It's a great idea, but the rationale isn't the issue. It's that many people online don't ever remember seeing these before. That's where the Mandela effect comes in. When I was doing research for something else entirely, and I first came across these photos, it made me second guess myself for a minute, like maybe this is a photoshopped photo or something else, but apparently it's real, and a lot of people are scratching their heads. So tell me, what do you think about all this? This specific photo right here is my absolute favorite because it's so nonsensical. I love it, and here's why. It doesn't seem real, but here it is. It's the perfect encapsulation of the term historical Mandela effect. So now if anyone ever says, what's a historical Mandela effect? You can just show them this photo, or this video. Everyone let me know, do you remember learning about Dazzle ships and barrage balloons storming the beaches of Normandy? How do you feel about all this? Many people believe one or both of these things regarding Benjamin Franklin. The first is that he discovered electricity with his kite and key experiment. The second being that his kite was struck by lightning. Both of these things, as of now, are false and have never been true. You know what I'm going to ask. Is that what you remember? Apparently, electricity had previously been discovered and was already widely known about in the scientific community by the 1750s. Ben Franklin's Kite and Key experiment was to test whether or not electricity was stored in the clouds, and if it could be stored for future use, like a battery, or as he called it, a Leyden jar. Secondly, his kite was never struck by lightning. If it had been, Ben Franklin would have been gravely injured, if not outright killed, since he was holding the string that the electricity would have traveled down. All this to explain that Ben Franklin did not discover electricity and was not struck by lightning during his kite experiment. But that's not all. Even his creation of the lightning rod is now not true. He didn't create the lightning rod, he simply advocated for a pointy tip on the lightning rod instead of the more common broad tip lightning rod, which, as I mentioned in my last video, doesn't attract lightning because it's metal, it attracts it because of its pointy shape, isolation, and height. Wow, what an educational adventure this has been. What do you remember? Is this the Mandela Effect changing things? Is it mass misremembering? Is it widely reported misinformation? I mean, honestly, who really knows anymore? I wonder what widely known and accepted fact isn't going to be true tomorrow.
War, terror, espionage. We try to avoid it, but war seems inevitable. Explosions on the home front, terror in the streets. Anarchy reigns as spies have infiltrated our very home. The Great War was a foreign issue, not domestic. But here we are. Neighbor versus neighbor. Friend against friend. The Statue of Liberty's torch may be damaged, but she's not out for the count. Her light will shine on.
Today I'd like to look back at my favorite Mandela Effect of all time and see what has changed since I first talked about it. It's been over 3 years, so what's new? What's the same? Has anything changed? And what strange details have I found along the way? The Black Tom Explosion. Let's check it out. First, let me set the historical scene. This major catastrophic event happened in 1916, and publicly, allegedly, everyone knew about it. Even though it was never taught in school or talked about, there were no articles in magazines, nothing written in books or mentions in encyclopedias. No TV shows talked about it or movies reenacted it. But apparently it was widely known to the public for over a century. I guess everyone forgot about it. It's amazing. It's one of the most important events in modern American history that completely changed the path and direction of the United States of America, but somehow everyone just forgot about it. The Black Tom Explosion is my favorite Mandela Effect because of the sheer absurdity of it all. No one remembers the first terrorist attack in American history. No one remembers that it created the Espionage Act. No one remembers that it was the reason the United States of America jumped into World War I. It's apparently even the reason you can't climb into the torch of the Statue of Liberty. The effects of it are felt everywhere, but somehow no one remembers ever hearing about this until a few years ago. Back when I first covered this, information, videos, pictures, maps, details, all of this was extremely scarce. I mean, they were hard to find. It took hours and hours and hours of research to collect what little I could find. Every single detail and image that I could find, I put into my New York video. So to start this off, I'm going to show you a clip from that video, and then we'll come back and talk about what has changed. Trust me, you'll be surprised by just how much is different now. The Black Tom Explosion. I consider myself a massive history buff who's addicted to documentaries and historical accounts of previous events and wars. I can't get enough of this stuff. So the most troubling Mandela Effect to me is what is considered the first terrorist attack in America. No, it wasn't Pearl Harbor. No, it wasn't 9/11. It was a German attack on American soil all the way back in 1916. Sound familiar? It doesn't to me. The setting is July 30th, 1916 in Jersey City, New Jersey, on Black Tom Island. Black Tom Island was a major ammunition and small arms depot providing arms to allies during World War I. 2 German agents working there posing as guards set off small fires all over the island, eventually setting off millions of pounds of explosives. This is called the Black Tom Explosion. Now, the strange part about this Mandela Effect is, because it is so big and so important, it causes massive ramifications throughout time. So it not only changes this one point in history, but it changes multiple things, and we're going to get into that as we go on. The first of which is now we're told that this is the turning point as to why the US joined World War I. But I was always told it was because of the sinking of the Lusitania. So it feels like a weird retcon of history for me, but what do you think? If this was just a simple attack, sure, I could accept possibly that I'd never heard of it, but it gets stranger. The explosion was so big that it would have registered as a 5 to a 5.5 earthquake on the Richter scale. It was felt as far away as Philadelphia and Maryland. This explosion destroyed more than 100 rail cars, 13 warehouses, and left a 375-foot by 175-foot crater in the ground. The damage was estimated to be $20 million back then, which is now closer to $470 million when adjusted for inflation. Amazingly enough, only 5 people died, although thousands were injured. Now here is where New York comes into this Mandela effect. Every window in a 25-mile radius was completely shattered, including thousands in Lower Manhattan and Times Square. The Brooklyn Bridge was shaken, but the most troubling piece of information is that the Statue of Liberty was greatly damaged as a result of the Black Tom explosion. What? Is this the Twilight Zone? The Statue of Liberty's torch-holding arm was greatly damaged by shrapnel and actually resulted in it closing down to the public, supposedly. But we'll get to that in a minute. The damage to Lady Liberty's arm and skirt was estimated to be $100,000 back then, which today would be over $2.3 million. I grew up pre and post 9/11. After that attack, terrorism is all anyone could talk about. How is it that despite that, I never once heard about the Black Tom explosion? Especially considering that the attack on the World Trade Center in 2001 was touted as being the first major attack on domestic soil. Why was the Black Tom explosion not mentioned during the extensive coverage of attacks to the US? Not a single mention. Not a single reporter or news anchor back then brought up the Black Tom explosion. There wasn't a single, "Today we remember the explosion on Black Tom Island." Nothing. There's nothing about it in the news. Even on YouTube, there are only so many videos about this topic. I'd say less than 30, maybe more than 20. The oldest of those videos is only 7 years old. Even the comments on that video were people asking, "What is this? I've never heard of this before. I was never taught this. This never happened." It's a pretty interesting read. I could very easily go on and on about this particular Mandela effect because it fascinates me to no end. But I want to know what you think. Do you remember learning or hearing about this German attack on our country that led us to World War I? Is this a Mandela effect for you? As always, let's hear it in the comments below. Now that you're up to speed with the Black Tom explosion, let's revisit Google and YouTube and see what changes have occurred in the last 3 or so years since I made that video. First up are the results when you search up Black Tom explosion or the Black Tom explosion on Google. This is the exact same Google account I used to look up the information I used in that video all those years ago, and look at the difference now. If you see purple text, that means I have clicked on that at some point in time. If it's blue text, that means I have never clicked it. The first result is a Wikipedia link. That comes up first and was clicked on me by today, not back then. Back then, a Wikipedia page for the Black Tom explosion didn't exist. I looked up and clicked on this link earlier today when I was considering talking about this topic again. After looking at that page for a while, I returned to the results and realized that there was so much blue, so many links that either weren't visible to me back then or didn't exist. I was stunned, so I took a screenshot of this and the next few pages of Google results. After looking through page after page, a grand total of 3 links had been clicked by me, one of which was by me today, the Wikipedia page. The other 2, history.com and cfr.org, both existed back then. None of this other stuff did, or at least didn't come up in the Google results back then. I'm kicking myself now for not screenshotting this 3 years ago. Could you imagine the before and after? Hear me when I say this. The results for the Black Tom explosion back then were drier than the desert. I mean, there was nothing. All those pictures you saw in the original clip, that was literally everything I could find at the time. I scraped into the wood of the bottom of the barrel to get those photographs and maps. It's the reason that I held on each image as long as I did. I needed those photos and maps to cover the amount of audio that I had recorded. So why am I talking about this? Well, all of this to make a point. What was seemingly unknown to even the internet is now a fully fleshed out and well-known event in history. It's got all the search results, images, and web pages that any other well-known historical event would have. It's just weird to me to know for a fact that it wasn't always this way. I was there. I even made a video on it. There was next to nothing before. And if someone was to look it up today, they would be none the wiser. I would sound irrational and out of my mind. They would say, "What are you talking about, all time? It's all right here." That reason is why I'm making this video. So next I went to photos to see if more had somehow materialized or been found, and yep, infinite photos, maps, and details. Pictures of leftover shells, diving photos, new pictures of the damage, the Statue of Liberty, new photos of all of it. It's so weird, especially to me. I've spent so much time researching this stuff that when I find something new, it sticks out like a sore thumb. You don't know how many times during the creation of this very video I said aloud, "Wait, is this new? Oh my god, this is new!" Stuff like this fascinates me to no end. It's like a bottomless mystery. In the clip I played earlier, I mentioned, even on YouTube there are only so many videos about this topic. I'd say less than 30, maybe more than 20. So here is a concrete, definitive thing we can look into. Less than 30, maybe more than 20 videos on YouTube. Well, I just counted every video relating specifically to the Black Tom explosion, and I stopped at 71. Not because it ended there, but because I think we all get the point. It's well known now, or at least a lot more well known than it was before. And here's the thing, people creating videos on this interesting topic isn't evidence of anything. That's to be expected. It's a really cool topic to talk about. But what is extremely weird is that there is now video footage of the Black Tom explosion, uploaded in 2013. Apparently, in my extensive hours and hours of researching this, I just never happened to find this clip. Okay, sure, you know what, I'll even grant that, maybe I missed this one. If it was just one hard to find clip, I'd accept that defeat. I'd own up to my failings, but it's not. It's right there in the search results, and it isn't just one. In Wikipedia, the CIA, and FBI all say 4, not 5. Weirder yet, there's an official Coast Guard video talking about the Black Tom explosion, and in that it says that 7 people died.
7 people died in the attack.
Oh, but wait, I found an article mentioning September 11th in relation to the Black Tom explosion. Finally, someone else besides me has made the connection. That's right, I found an article from September 2001, and this article goes on to repeat the exact same talking points that I've said a million times, except for one differing detail. One detail was different. The author says, quote, "The Black Tom death toll was mercifully low, 50 at most." Huh? Wait, now it's 50? 50 people died? So it wasn't 5, it was 4. It wasn't 4, it was 7. It wasn't 7, it was 50. And that's low? That's on the low end? What was the high end? Come on, history, get your story straight. What's interesting too is all of the new entertainment media surrounding the Black Tom explosion. I say new, but maybe I should really say totally existed but no one remembers it existing, but it was recently rediscovered. For example, there is a PBS show called History Detectives. Now this show had an entire episode on a woman who had a shell that apparently survived the Black Tom explosion. The way the story plays out is that the woman had the shell in her family dating back all the way to when the Black Tom explosion happened. She knew this not just because of the stories that had been passed down to her over the generations, but also because of a passed down handwritten note which reads, "Black Tom explosion of 1914. A little bit off on that date. I've also noticed that in every article and video regarding this topic, everyone is so surprised how little known the Black Tom explosion actually is, about how little press coverage it got, or how unknown this major attack was, or how often it was forgotten, etc. I've yet to find a single piece of media talking about this event as if anyone had ever heard of it before. Every article and video sounds like it's a new thing they just discovered, and they want to be the first to share it with the world. For this being in the public eye for over a century, 100+ years, it's flooring how little it's known. Watching this PBS episode about this shell and the event is the perfect example of what I'm talking about. The history detective is constantly blown away by how little she knows about this event, how no one talks about it. Here's a series of clips taken from that broadcast to accentuate my point.
Black Tom is little known and strangely faded from history. I'm curious why this major story received such minor press coverage, although the 1916 blast must also have sown widespread panic and fear. I'd never heard of the disaster.
There were explosions at munitions depots in Ohio and in Missouri and in Detroit and in Delaware. This happened to be the biggest one.
On Ellis Island, shrapnel rained down for over 3 hours.
How many people died in the explosion?
The official death toll was 6. But you got to remember, this is the time where it's at the height of immigration, at Ellis Island, and there were hundreds of people living in boats and barges in the harbor here who the police speculate literally turned to dust.
This is the common thread with everything regarding the Black Tom explosion. And honestly, it makes me raise an eyebrow. What about you? Have you ever heard of the Black Tom explosion before this video, or my last video on it? Digging deeper into this, I looked for references to the Black Tom explosion, specifically in media related to World War I. My thought process was there has to be something out there that mentioned it, right? Well, I found a reference in a video game, of all things. Battlefield 1, a first-person shooter game released in 2016, has a codex entry about the Black Tom explosion in it. It's a short little blurb you unlock after watching a certain explosion on a mountainside. Now this little blurb is nothing special. It's a tiny detail. It's a throwaway piece of information. But I find it interesting because finally this event is starting to leak into more mainstream and widely experienced media. I'm calling it right now. It's only a matter of time before this becomes a movie or is featured in a TV show. When that day comes, I want you to think of me. After that, I started looking into sources for details regarding the Black Tom explosion. If it was as publicly and widely known as everyone keeps repeating like a broken record, then there would be numerous sources to read up on and investigate, right? Nope. Outside of the CIA and the FBI websites, there are shockingly few, and I mean shockingly few. The oldest source that I could find, outside of straight up scans of newspapers, is a book called The Enemy Within, The Inside Story of German Sabotage in America, by Henry Landau. Henry was a British Army officer and served in France during World War I, when the Black Tom explosion actually happened. After the war, he took a post within MI6, but grew bored of it and moved on with his life. He immigrated to the US in 1923 and became a citizen in 1933. During the 1930s, Henry wrote a series of books about his time as a spy, all of which were published in the United States to avoid prosecution under the Official Secrets Act, the British legislation which punishes the sharing of official state secrets. Henry was ready to spill secrets for financial gain, but he didn't want to deal with the ramifications. As it turns out, Henry got away with it, and eventually landed a good job working as an investigator for the Federal Works Agency and then the U.S. Maritime Commission. In regards to MI6 and the British government, Henry Landau was considered persona non grata, as in a person who had had their diplomatic immunity from arrest and prosecution removed. I think it's pretty interesting that Henry got away with all of it and was happily accepted into the U.S. It makes you wonder, but that's a mystery and a story for another time. Henry's book was published in 1937, a total of 21 years after the Black Tom explosion, by someone that wasn't there. He wasn't even in the country when it happened. This is the oldest source listed regarding the Black Tom explosion, anywhere. This is it. A book that came out 21 years after the fact by a former British man who wasn't even in America when it happened. The words that Henry wrote in that book have been used to source this event in almost everything written about it ever since. The Black Tom explosion is an incredible event in regards to history. It was destructive, deadly, and future-altering. Now, I'm not here to tell you this didn't happen, or that it wasn't real. As it stands now, apparently this event happened, and seemingly everyone forgot. This is a Mandela effect because collectively, no one remembered this. Mandela effect changes don't just change in one direction. Just as a movie can disappear, or a logo can now seem altered, history can be modified as well. This major event feels like it was created and inserted into our collective history, and slowly people have become aware of this event and shrugged. Regardless of how you feel or what your take on all this is, we can all agree that this is an amazing topic to talk about. It's thought-provoking, in-depth, and filled with twists and turns. This major historical event that created lasting changes to our world was somehow forgotten by everyone until just a few years ago. It went from having no coverage at all to having a small amount when I made my last video, to now having a massive amount of information available. It's weird and there's a lot I don't understand about it, but I love talking about it and I hope you enjoyed listening to it. Thank you all so much for watching. Like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon. I'm Alltime. Until next time. When you visit the Statue of Liberty, can you go up into the torch? What I learned when I was younger was that you were always able to go into the head of the Statue of Liberty and the torch. I heard that it was shut down for a while in the 1980s for refurbishment and repairs, but after that was finished, you could still visit the torch. Only after the attacks in 2001 were you not allowed up there anymore. Now, perhaps everything I was taught was wrong, and it's always been wrong, but that's what I've always known and have been taught. The truth as it is now is that not since 1916 could you go up into the torch. Does that sound strange to anyone? Now, to bring everything together, the reason you can't go inside of it is because of the structural damage caused by the Black Tom explosion. Another detail I find interesting is the belief that it was closed in the 1980s for simple refurbishment and repairs, to fix the years and years of wear and tear. That isn't actually what it was. It was once again to work on the damage caused by the explosion. Another one where I'm like, what? Again, why did no one ever talk about the Black Tom explosion if it's what caused those problems? What's interesting for this Mandela effect is that you can find residue all over the internet of people remembering how they visited the torch. They went there as a kid, they went there as an adult, they went there with their grandparents. Recounts of people's experiences can be found all over the internet if you want to look further into this, but for now, I'll leave it at that.